So Gary here. So we're going to talk about developing a survey paper and story-based surveys, which is what going to be your primary assignment for this semester. Is you're going to be developing a survey paper at least 8 to 10 pages in length with at least 50 references. Now you're not doing that this next week. That's the whole semester. You'll eventually be turning in multiple drafts and a final paper. You'll be giving and getting feedback on your paper as you go along this. And I'm going to break this down into steps so we get started. So your first assignment, which is this week, I already touched on, is sort of getting the lay of the land. You're to search for other survey papers in your area, and I want you to scan, read at least 5 of those survey papers, and you're going to analyze their stories. So we're going to talk a little bit about stories, but I want to give you some context to think about both stories, survey stories, and how to write some of your own or organize some of the story ideas. So what makes a good story? And just as a reminder, if you've not watched the videos on storytelling, go do that first, then come back to this video. This video is supposed to be watched after those. So I'm gonna actually just pause the video or pause my speaking for a second. I want you to stop the video or just listen to the video because I'll give you the time right here. I want you to think of 5 characteristics of a good survey paper in terms of a story, and I want you to put that in your journal before you continue. Then you can listen to the rest of this video. So I'm going to pause my talking. I'm going to leave the video going as though this was in class and think about it. If once you know what those 5 things are, you can open up your journal, write some of those insights down that you're going to get to. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, hopefully that was long enough. If not, go ahead, pause it, and keep writing your journal before you go on. Okay, so when you think about writing survey papers, right, one of the things you have to look at in terms of what's a good topic for a good, impactful survey, you're going to have to satisfy, in my view, the following requirements. First, the ideal thing is a new subfield or a subfield or new thing that's got something newly emerging. A survey of stuff that's been out there for a while is not going to be as exciting. Uh, Ideally, this will have something where the popularity of the field will grow over time. So if you can get yourself in on the ground floor of an emerging topic, that's great for where you want to be with a survey paper. Um, but it's a survey paper, so there has to be a critical number of papers with the new algorithms, new approaches, whatever, have to exist, right? At least 20, ideally 40, maybe 100, right? There's got to be enough papers out there for you to be surveying them, right? This is not new research. This is about a survey. Um, Ideally, you, the author or authors, if there's multiple, have to be enthusiastic about the particular topic. This is not critical, but in general, in my view, it helps if you are. Why are you studying this if it's not something you're enthusiastic? Um, some of you might have listed, when you think about, you might not have listed these, but I think some of you might have said that a good survey paper is one where there does not exist a survey paper. And then something is going to present a new and useful organization of the space in terms of the story we're going to tell. My view is it's got to present a new and useful way of looking at that. Okay, and I'm going to go back and cross out number 5. And this might be one that some of you did. And I'll put it a little bit in context, right? If I actually look at this is for some previous work on how many citations survey papers get based on how many surveys were out there. So this is a particular subtopic, and these slides are a little bit old, but to sort of give you an idea of what's going on. So when this first survey paper came out on this particular topic, if there were no surveys preceding it, this paper showed that they got 30 some references. But if it was preceded by one survey paper, this other paper showed sort of that you get 70s, and then if there's 2 preceding survey papers, you can get a whole lot more. And One of the reasons for this is that if there are existing surveys, it shows there's people interested in this area. Um, and if there are no surveys, then there may not be a lot of interest in the area. So that's one of the reasons there are no surveys. So there's a trade-off. It's not inherent that there's no survey, but when I look at the papers, there's also a function of their style. Is the paper a pure survey paper? Sometimes you'll get things that are survey papers mostly, and then a little bit of research. Papers are mixture of survey and research, a little bit of survey and research, or research only. Even research only papers tend to have a little bit of related work, but you can sort of see that the number of citations papers get tend to be dominated. Good survey papers get a lot more citations. Really good research papers can get a lot of citations, and things that are in the middle are not a good mix. So you either want one end or the other. But coming back to this idea of what makes a good survey, so before we get into that, so the reason I like to cross this out, but leave it with a little bit there, is if a good survey paper came out last year, it's hard to have a good survey. But if you can get to this presentation of a new and useful organization of the space, if you can tell a new and important story different from last year's survey paper, then even if it came out last year, there might be another direction you can go that will take it. So part of the reason we're going to focus on this story is so that you can actually look at it that way. Okay, so when we're looking at a particular example for survey papers tend to have a bunch of papers in them. And so when you start looking at them, sorry, I'm going to have to edit that out. Okay, so in a good survey paper, you're going to have a lot of papers that are going to be comparison. That's, it's a survey. It's got a lot of papers in it. And in next week's lecture, we'll get a little more detail about how to analyze the papers and how to look for gaps. But for this week, we're just going to say there's going to be a lot of papers that go in to tell a compelling story. But a good survey is not just a summary. It is not a book report where you have, here's paper one, here's paper two, here's paper three. You might do some of that analysis as you're putting together your analysis of the papers, but when you get done, you've got to compare and contrast the papers. In my view, you have to tell a story with a theme and a goal, which I'll get to in just a bit. Sort of the storytelling you watch in those other videos. Importantly, you're going to have to help others organize their ideas. That's part of the goal of a survey, is to tell the story that organizes the field, or at least a piece of it. It doesn't have to be complete, but it should be thorough enough within its theme or story. You can't necessarily cover all papers in an area, but I have to have enough of them to compel my story and move it up. And ideally, if you're lucky, you'll open up new directions for the readers. That's one of your goals. People will be excited if they read their paper and they have new ideas of something they want to do. So here are my 10 steps to making a good survey paper. So the first is to read about the general subject and related surveys to get your feel for what's going on, which is part of your assignment for this week. And ideally, you actually want to think about a target journal. That, to me, is important because different journals have different styles, different lengths, different expectations. For this assignment, I have not told you have to go pick a journal. I actually think after you've read a little bit more, you'll be in a better position to do that. So we'll save that for later. Though when I'm writing a survey, that's normally something you do pretty much up front, but that's only if you have enough experience. So the next thing is you want to develop your key story idea for the survey. After you've done that related survey search, you want to come up with a storytelling, which is your assignment for this week. And as part of that, you can talk about your proposed classification approach, which we'll get to in just a second. And then you're going to select 40 to 80 papers based on the various approach from the literature, your classification ideas. And you want to be able to explain why your classification represents a contribution to science. Step 2 might actually be iterative. You might do this multiple times as you try and, I don't have enough papers for my story, and so you might have to iterate a few times. But it's really, you want to have that laid out before you get too deep into each of the papers. although you might end up analyzing a bunch of the papers and then finding I have a gap and I got to fill some stuff in. So the next step, step 3, is to sort of, for each of the papers, for each of the examples, and I'm going to say cover the examples might be in your classification. I actually like doing it this way, but you're going to analyze each of the 48 papers using the techniques discussed later in this talk. So I'll talk about some of those techniques in just a bit. So you might analyze the same paper 2 or 3 times because you're looking at it from different points of view in your classification. You're going to use the analysis and place the paper within the template classification, connecting them via comparison to represent a contribution to science and also conform to your story. So you can do this multiple ways. You can analyze each paper and then put them together in pieces, or you can go after each paper looking at it from the point of view of classification. Either of those 2 techniques will work, but you have to get an analysis of at least parts of each of those papers to make this work. You're going to pick some of the key points of comparisons among the papers. You might end up trying different points of comparison and analyze way more than the final number of papers. Your final survey might have 40 papers in it. You might have analyzed 80 or 100. Depending on how you're doing this, if you're doing it where you're choosing classification, then going looking for papers, you might even throw away 100 papers because they didn't quite fit where you were going. There's different ways of analyzing those key points to make sure they fit within your story. For each point of comparison among the many papers, so basically for each major element of your classification, ideally you want to generate a figure or 2, one sort of a block structure, one pseudocode representing presentation of the algorithm, or one core of the idea. There's lots of ways of doing it, but I am going to encourage you to have 2 different ways of drawing or having figures to explain what's going on. And then you're going to choose a presentation form that indicates the essence of the class in your classification that the example belongs to. You may end up not using all of these, but again, during the development, my recommendation is you generate them. Then you can decide how they fit in and what better tells your story. If you ended up generating a classification that has a class that has no examples or has only one example, in a sense, that can be really desirable because that's sort of saying, here's new areas of research. Or you might need to expand the area. If you have a classification where one of the areas has way too many, you might need to refine it. So you'll iterate a little bit on the classification and have some discussion about how you chose what goes in each of those papers. If you're looking at the paper's strategy, the story, you want to define the research strategy for those who decide to analyze sort of a hybrid approach consisting of 2 different elements or 2 different classes. Hybrid approaches, if you're analyzing things that combine things, can either be a symbiosis, 2 solutions used interchangeably as the condition dictates, or is it synergy, 2 solutions combined to 1. Discuss the possible new solutions, symbiosis and synergy, and possible learning avenues for new directions and new inventions. This is an easy way for you to sort of take 2 things that seem somewhat disparate but can be combined, and this allows you to have a much stronger story than just here's a bunch of papers, even stronger than here's a comparison. Because a comparison of the 2 papers, the papers might have already had some level of comparison between them, but the reader doesn't get near as much out of a comparison as they do out of this sort of hybrid synergy, where it's like, oh, here's things that can be combined. After you get done, and that this is, in my view, really is after you're done, you're going to generate a preamble and a conclusion in the form of the final text for the paper. The preamble and conclusion can actually be done once per section if you have a classification where you have multiple sections. We'll see that in just a second. And can also exist over the whole paper, sort of recursive view. Ideally, you want to go back and find one pearl of wisdom that sheds light on the essence of the paper or the essence of that section. And the more succinct you can make that 1-sentence story of a piece of the paper or of the whole story, that's going to increase the probability the paper can be referenced a lot, because people will say, oh yeah, this is the paper that did that. And that's why for your assignment, I want you to try and generate a 1-sentence story of the papers. You may see something as you go through that, okay? Then the last 2 steps are getting people to review your paper and edit. It takes a lot of work to edit surveys. You're going to submit the paper to a journal. With moderate probability, your first version of this will be rejected. Then you're going to go back and edit some more and work on the story to try and make it better. As long as you've done a novel story and a novel classification, there's probably a good chance you can get this out there, as long as it's an area that's got enough people and there's enough novelty to what you're doing. So as I said, you're going to have a lot of papers that go in here. I'm going to touch on this now. We'll actually come back to it again as we look at gap analysis. but what is you do when you're analyzing a paper for a survey? So I like to start with sort of the 7-step process. You're going to analyze it where you start with these 7 items. So the first is actually 7 again, right? So it's 7 and 7. 7 W's about the survey example, the paper you're going to try and include. Who's in it, what, where, when, why, who, for whom, and how is it used? This is sort of just a couple of sentences that helps you be able to make sure you're putting the right classification. So this would be at least maybe a little bit more than a scan, but not necessarily a full critical read. You'd look through the paper, figure out these 7 W's. What's the essence? Trying to get what's the essence of the paper in 1 or 2 sentences. Sometimes papers will have 2 things, and then you can have 2 or 3 sentences. So again, not as much as a full critical or creative read. Survey papers might not get that level of detail. It might live somewhere in between a scan and a critical read. Sometimes you're going to want to analyze the structure of the paper or the experiments. Some of the relevant details of those can be useful. For example, when you're clustering papers for doing a comparison, having a bunch of papers that share the same data set or analyze data in the same way, that's part of their structure. It can also be part of the relevant details that lets you get there. Is there some example from the paper that you can use to help explain what's going on, some pseudocode, some application that you could use that might be consistent across multiple surveyed examples? For you, write down your pros and your cons of the paper, and then how it fits in your classification and your opinion of this example and its potential. Now, you might not actually have all of these for every paper. If you're doing a very short survey paper, you might only end up with room for 20 or 30 papers and a sentence or 2 about them. For longer surveys, each of these template elements, you might have more details. You might get into a paragraph. For books, each of these could be much more. It depends on how much detail you're going to get into. So it depends on that's part of the reason I like to start with where are you going. If you're doing an ACM survey, you're going to have a much more detailed example than if you're doing an 8-page survey, which is what you have to do for this class. So this is about how you take your notes. This is not what you put in your survey paper. This is analyzing the paper. So in your Zotero notes about a paper, these are the kinds of things I recommend you have. So as you're doing your survey, you might start collecting some background papers. Think about how you would put this together. Now, I mentioned one of the key elements of a good survey paper is its classification, and how you tell the story will often relate back to this. So there are a couple of different approaches for how you classify things. One of the most classic is a binary or an n-ary criterion. And as I apply multiple criterion, I can end up with basically a tree where I have some criterion that puts them into 2 categories. Each of those categories can then be broken up, and it doesn't have to be balanced tree, it can be whatever. That classification allows you to group together papers. Now, if the classification is done well, the papers don't necessarily end up in only one of these. The same paper could be in 2 different ways depending on how the classifications work. Another technique that I've used, and it shows up in a few papers, which I'll get to, I'll expand this in a second, is basically where I have dimensions where it's not binary, it's actually a sort of continuum. And I like to call these cube-like classifications, where there's sort of dimensions, and papers can live along this dimension, then they can live this dimension, and then they live as a point somewhere in space. As you can sort of see, our paper, the paper that I was talking about, we're sort of living at this point of intersection. Characteristics of all of these things. So as you do this, I think it's useful to try and prepare a figure that includes the classification criterion, some of the classification actual results. If you have any sort of technical or symbolic mnemonics that help people remembering is part of a good storytelling. Not necessarily all, but maybe some of the selected examples per class, maybe a full list of references depending on how big your thing is, and maybe a vector of relevant characteristics to sort of show this. So just to sort of explain a little bit more, like, so in this example, this is one of these cube-based things. There are papers that sort of have, like this paper here has a little bit of this dimension, a little bit of that dimension, and then there's a reference. This is not the actual reference number. This is like the author's name and where it's from. The nice thing about this is if, depending on how I'm doing my submission, some people will have reference styles that have numbers, some that will have full names. When you're doing this figure, you don't want to have to redo it every time you change things. So it's nice to have it in a way that you can easily go look stuff up. If you can do that, that's great. By putting the papers together this way, you let people part of the value for them of this classification, they can look and say, oh, look, here's papers I know, and now I see how they fit in. Part of this is setting the context. Whoops, wrong key. Some of that is setting the context. So here's another example where you're going to have, this is a tree-based classification. So you have internet search algorithms, and then mutational databases and conceptual modeling, random search targets. These are different subcategories, and then they actually have some criterion for how things are broken up into the different categories. Lots of tree algorithms, you can either be mutational database or concept modeling, but that doesn't mean there's papers that don't have these things together, which makes it more of a graph than a tree. The goal is to be able to help people understand both how you're organizing your thoughts, but then also maybe how the paper gets laid out. So you want to be able to connect this back to your story. We've talked a little bit about the other videos, talked a little bit about storytelling. We'll get into that in just a second. But one way of thinking about this is, if you think about TV shows or other stories you've seen, right? They often have sub-stories, and the sub-stories will sometimes jump back and forth, but they have a way that relate back to the main story, but there's still pieces of it. So your classification can be sort of the chapters or the sub-stories of the main story, and your classification allows you to tell bits and pieces of it where you then come back to at the end and connect it to the main story. So now I'm going to take a little bit of a jump, assuming we've got through all of the stuff. This is about writing as a process. And so writing as a process is something that's going to be core for this class. So I wanted to get a few of these exercises in. They're not particular to survey papers, but they are related, and you'll see why as we get to them in a second. So a writing process is a little bit of how to get started, and a good process helps you be better at writing. And I want you to get this process thinking about it in terms of storytelling as well, because the earlier you think about your story in terms of your writing process, it's better. And I use the word process here very intentionally because many of you think of writing as literally putting the words down on the page, and what we're going to start with here is actually a writing process that isn't that. So in my view, when you do a writing process, there's really three things. Pre-writing, about 25% of your time. Writing, the actual writing of stuff, about 20% of the time. And then rewriting is about 50% of your time. And sometimes actually change this around, and pre-writing might be 50% of your time. Writing is 25 and rewriting is 25. And actually, I think for a survey paper, I would actually go with that latter. So in fact, maybe I should make this slide different and make this and the reason for survey papers is a lot of the pre-writing is about reading the papers, figuring out the ideas, figuring out the story, and rewriting is a little bit less, because once you've written it, now you have to edit a little bit to make it work well. When you're doing your original research, that also depends on how you count the doing the research is not part of pre-writing. But once you have that, then there's a little bit about the storytelling, and it's generally a little bit less. And you spend more time rewriting it as you get results. When we get to actually writing a research paper, very often you've done the pre-writing and the writing before you have the experimental results, and so that might end up doing a little bit of rewriting. If you have a good process and good timelines, you want to have good tools. You want to be using Git and LaTeX, which is what we prefer, but you can also do that with Word and LaTeX and Dropbox. So tools are a part of it. If you're not good at your tools, then you can waste a lot of time, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. So, but in my view, the biggest mistake when you can, as a writer, is waiting until it's ready, let alone waiting for it to be perfect. The rewriting process begins when you first show your first draft to people and start getting feedback. Beethoven went through 70 drafts of some of his symphonies, and as William Zissner is a famous writer, right? Rewriting is where the game is won or lost. Rewriting is the essence of writing. So depending on how you want to view the process, you're starting to write your story now, and you're going to rewrite it lots of times. You're going to get feedback. You're going to continue to evolve it. And so we want to put a lot of that together. The first part of this is what I like to call about shitty first drafts. And it's also a little bit about why I don't recommend starting with an outline. Some of you might have been taught to write where the first thing you do is you make an outline of what you want to do. In my view, that's for lots of people, that's not very effective. It can be. If it works for you, that's okay. I'm not saying you not to do it. But to me, the distinction between an outline and a first draft is more about the story than it is about the actual structure. And getting a draft of the whole story, seeing how the story works together, even though you don't have all the details, is better than trying to structure it, because I find that structured outlines tend not to make good stories. And all first drafts are bad, so you might as well get one and get that done before you can start making things better. So when you get done, you want to have your draft. So we're going to try and get you to have a full draft of your story. And I'm going to push back on students a lot more this year than I did last year. Last year, I had a bunch of students who tried to turn in like the first 2/3 or first third of their survey paper as more complete drafts, but they hadn't finished their story. I'm going to push you this time to have your whole story done before you fill in the details. So the next exercise is just, it's a little bit of fun. It's a little bit of trying to get you to think more in terms of not your traditional way of writing. So for many people, this is particular to me, but I've learned that this works for lots of students. Words get in their way, right? Seeing words slows you down when you're thinking, often makes you want to edit. If you see that squiggly line show up, you want to fix it then. So I want you to try and do something different. I want you to close your eyes and I want you to write in your native language about your own research idea, about your survey ideas. I want you to just sit down and write. You're going to spend, you're free to jump between multiple ideas. You're free to, but you got to spend at least 30 seconds on each. So I'm going to tell you when to stop. Again, I'm going to walk away. I'm going to leave this video playing, and I will come back. But I want you to just close your eyes and either write on paper, and then you can put it in your journal later. You can take a photo and put it in your journal, or you can open up your laptop and type. I want you to do it with your eyes closed. I'm not worrying about accuracy, whatever. If you can touch type with your eyes closed, great. But I want you to do it without seeing what you write. I want you to just think in your head and try and get some of your ideas down on paper, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. No peeking, come on, just write with your eyes closed. Okay, that should be long enough to get you to feel, and if you're writing one off the page, that's okay. And if you feel you want to take a little bit more, again, pause the video, try this. Many students find this very difficult in the beginning, but I want you to get this idea of thinking about stuff and not worrying about writing in the words, because that's the most important part as you begin to tell the story. You've got to get that story in your head. Now, for many, in fact, trying to write with your eyes closed is hard. So for many, a much better way of doing this is to talk. It's easy to talk with your eyes closed. It's easy to talk because you can't see the words. It doesn't get you focused on it, right? So an easy way to do this is use your laptop or your phone and record your first draft. You can get an app that does dictation and talk to it. You can get a lot farther than looking at the text, right? But don't look at it as it types for you, because then you want to fix stuff. The ideal dictation software saves your voice and text, but raw text is often good enough to prompt your memory. And so I do this all the time. I use my phone. You can use Google Docs as a voice type input. Microsoft Word has dictation software. Apple, they all have dictation software these days, and it's not bad. It's not going to be perfect, but again, you're trying to get your ideas down, not capture the perfect text, because that's editing and stuff you get to later. So this is a great way to make progress, to think about ideas. And importantly, it's also a great way, using your phone, to capture ideas. Like, you might be walking to your car. Use that as time to think about some of your story elements or whatever, and then you use your phone to capture it. You can always play it back later and use that. So I want you to look back, no matter how you did it, if you were just writing with the eyes closed, but more importantly, if you're using a voice recording, you want to look back and try and find a storyline. You want a sticky story. We'll find that later in another class. Actually, you saw that because sticky stories were in the videos you're supposed to have watched already. You want to think about what's novel, what's useful, what's interesting, and look for possible flows, things that connect. So if you can find what surprises you in work, that's great. So if you're reading a bunch of papers, right, and you can then sort of try and summarize them in terms of your story, again, for your survey, right? Read the papers and then try and tell the story verbally to your phone. Then you have to abstract away the details. You're not going to get bogged down. You're not going to think about the exact words. You're going to think about the broader concepts, right? And if you can remember it and you can find a way to tell the story that helps it remember, that's great, because when it comes down to it, if they can't remember your work, if they can't remember what you're talking about, they won't accept or cite your work. So you got to be able to tell your story. And this is true not just for surveys, this is true for your research, right? If you can find a way to make it memorable without looking at the details, you're way far along the path making it a better story. Okay, so as I said, way too many students in their surveys, they're book reports with many independent summaries. You don't want to have, here's paper one, here's paper two, you're not doing this where you're walking through each paper and sort of saying, this is what each of the papers say. That's not exciting to anybody. If they wanted to do that, they could just collect a bunch of abstracts and go through them. They're really trying to get from you something that is a much more of a story that connects, compares, contrasts, right? So after reading, try using voice typing with your eyes closed to tell the story that relates the papers via comparison. This forces you to ignore the too many details and find a bigger picture that connects them. You can do this per section of your paper. Then you can add in details to support the story. We want details, but you don't want the details to drive the story. They're there to support the story. So read a couple of papers, then try 3 or 4 different ways maybe to connect them via comparison, and see if you can tell a compelling way of making that happen. So another part of that technique that I like to do is to listen to your inner child. And at least for the first draft, your inner child, for most of you, is more playful, creative, it's full of ideas. And it's exactly what you want to think of in your first draft. So I like to try and do this to get you to your inner child, is to think in terms of pictures, shapes, and characters. So I'm going to go back and do that the sort of the same kind of example, but and you're talking about your research or your survey ideas, whatever. I want you to go back and I want you to tell the story in your inner child's voice. Tell a story. Don't tell me the details. Tell me a story. You've already watched videos and what is a story? I want to hear that, and I'll tell you when to stop. Right? So go back, write it down. This time you can use your eyes, but I want you to tell the story as though you were telling it to a child or from a child's point of view. Right? Tell me as though I'm 10. What's important about this? Okay, so I'll go ahead and let you stop now. This is if you were able to do it with figures, that's great. If you want to, uh, if you did it with figures, if not, we're going to go on. We're going to do the same thing. And now I want you to try and do this, no matter what you wrote, whatever you came up with. I want you to see if you can do this with figures. Can you do it as a sort of cartoon or comic book? You can change the order to make it a more meaningful story. Like most comic books have a sequence of elements. So try and do the same thing with this sort of caption. Now, this might be hard if you're trying to do it on a laptop, so this might be a place to pull out a napkin or a piece of paper and draw stuff and then just take a photo to put in your journal. Do not spend a lot of time trying to do detailed drawing. That's not what we're looking for here. This is a sketch of ideas. If you don't have good drawing abilities, I don't care. Stick figures are fine. Simple box diagrams, right? This is about trying to capture the idea of the story in pictures, not in words. And again, I'll give you a couple of minutes to work on that. Okay, I'd like to pause long enough to make you have to do some of this. If you're on a roll and you want to keep going, pause the video and go on. But at this point, I'll continue on with the lecture. So now I'm going to jump back. I'm going to hit a few of the things about storytelling that were in the other videos I had you watch and in the chapter, but I'm going to adapt a few of them. I didn't get as quite into storytelling for surveys, and when I've given this lecture in the past, some students had some difficulty. So I'm going to adapt it just a little bit more and talk a little bit about this. But again, storytelling is two parts: story and telling. First, you got to figure out what's the good story, and then you can worry about how to write it up, right? And so one of the reasons I just did this exercise with trying to get you to think in terms of the figures is that's about trying to figure out what is the story, what are the elements, how do they put together, who are the characters. When you try and draw stuff, characters make stuff a lot easier. Lots of students struggle with how do I tell science stories, right? So as was in the book, right? Storytelling has three core elements. You, the storyteller, the story itself, and then the audience and how you relate to them. Understanding who your audience is a critical part of storytelling. If I also look at this in terms of science, I like to think of the scientific truth. So when you're writing a survey paper, there is some underlying science that you're trying to get to, and you're trying to help the audience understand that scientific truth through the story. That's going to be your mediation, right? But in all stories, the core of a good story has some problems and conflicts, some risks and dangers to help the main character reach their goals. And so we have to put all these together, the 8 essential story elements. In every good story or narrative, there's a main character. Who is the main character? What traits make them interesting? What do the character need to do or get? Those are the goals of the character. Why is that goal important? That's the motive for the reader. What conflicts and problems block the character? So what are the difficulties you run into? How do they create risks or dangers? what does a character do, what struggles you do to reach those goals, and then whatever sensory details will make the story seem real and seem important. Now, a lot of these are true from Walt Disney. They're true if I'm writing a good science paper, and we're going to talk about how to adapt some of these, right? One of the first things for your survey, the survey process, is what I like to think of is the theme and the takeaway message. And this is true for lots of stories, but not all stories have a theme and a takeaway message. Because if it's just entertainment, you don't have to have that. But even good Disney things have a theme and a takeaway message they're trying to get to. And a great way of trying to think about this for your survey paper is to come up with a good metaphor and a good classification technique. And that metaphor and that classification help people understand how to put bits and pieces of the science that exists into context. And once they can put it into context, then they will have a deeper understanding of the science, right? Once you have the metaphor and the classification, you're going to help use that to define the story's characters. And we'll get to what are characters in a second as a couple of examples, right? And then you can build the story elements around the characters and the metaphor. And you're going to adjust that for your audience and for the media. If you're doing something that you expect this to be going to an audience that is people who are more advanced, then you're going to have a slightly different way of presenting all that than if this is for the neophyte, right? So you can be doing a survey that is aimed at a magazine article that is a bunch of people who are generalists and don't know much about your field, or you can be writing or a general magazine like computer surveys, which is not particular to a topic, or you can be writing for a particularly narrow journal, and in which case you might have a different way of approaching that. Okay, so when we talk about the process, you really have two things. Merging your content. So you have done all these, you've read through all these papers. You want to combine that with an effective story structure. So you want to do that by going back, and as I said, there's really, if we go back to the essential elements, right, there were 2, 3, and 4 were goals and motives, and you want to put these together. So the goal is for the character, and we'll see some examples for a survey, but the goal, if the character, for example, is a computer system, then the goal is for that system. It should be physical, tangible, identifiable. And so for an algorithm, for example, that is like how I measure its performance. And that sort of defines the story's ending because you've reached the goal, we've advanced the state of the art. It provides purpose and meaning for the story. So that's the goal for the character, which is often an algorithm or the science or an approach, right? But it could be real physical people, so real people. If you're looking at things like privacy or security, right, it could be the security aspects of that, right? The theme is for the reader. This relates to the human condition. So I, as a researcher, readers are generally for you, right? These are things you want the reader to ponder. They let you interpret the characters and events, and the characters not even be aware of the theme. Normally, characters are not. Your characters in storytelling in Disney, right? They're human type characters. Characters in lots of science stories are the science, the algorithm, the system, right? They have no idea what the theme is. You want to keep both of these in mind, and as you're trying to develop your story, as you're actually reading through the things, when you do this week's assignment, I want you to be able to think a little bit about what is the theme and what is the goal separately for the papers. The theme is the core of your message. And the story is the vehicle that's going to effectively communicate a message and help that message stick. And it might seem a little weird to you, but this is going back to the story, right? This is the bare bones element version is actually 6 of the 8 essential elements, right? So the character, the system, the algorithm, the end user, the company, whatever, right, needs something because something happens, but something is stopping it from being successful. So they made some advance this way, finally producing this result. This is the one sentence bare bones version. And I want you to try and go through each of the papers you read, each of the survey papers, and come up with one to 3, because some of the papers will have multiple elements because there might be multiple characters. But I don't want the character to be just one algorithm. I want it to be a collection of things that you're looking at. So your challenge is to be able to define for your stories problems and conflicts, risks and dangers for the audience. They're always there, right? They drive at least all good stories. You can have a book report that doesn't have these, but then no one cares. That doesn't mean stories are about failure. They can often be about success, but there are challenges along the road to success. So talking about what makes some problems difficult from a science point of view is part of good science storytelling. Okay, it doesn't mean physical danger, no. Emotional, mental, social, professional, physical danger, any of those will do. Embarrassment, rejection, lack of knowledge, right? There's a ton of things that can be going on. But in science and engineering stories, accuracy, speed, cost, those are also dangers if your audience has the right context for those as dangers. If not, part of your job in the storytelling is to make it clear why that matters. It's surprising how many people talk about accuracy or speed, but they haven't tried to put it in context that makes the audience understand this is a 1% change. Is that 1% important or not? Can you turn that into a context that makes it a little bit better? Will be part of a good storytelling. And in a survey, that's often a way of finding a new dimension. So if you have 5 papers that are all worried about speed, but the speed difference is tenths of seconds in a system that has to interact with humans, tenths of seconds may not matter at all. So then you can shift it to what are the costs of this algorithm, right? And so you often have this balance of multiple dimensions, and the dangers, when put in human context, might allow you to lump a bunch of stuff together and say, here's a different way of looking at them that's maybe a little more important that other people haven't looked at. So the first 2 of these are science text story layouts that were in the video, so those are pretty straightforward. So who's the main character in this version 1 of a science text story? And it's either the science, the tech, the algorithm, the system, the theory of the paper. And so at a paper by paper level, this might be the main character of that paper. What makes them memorable, interesting, right? So this helps the reader understand why. Understanding why something works is way more important, especially when you're doing a survey, because if I can collect why things work, then the reader gets a take-home message. If I can find 3 things that work for the same reason, the why is shared, that's a way to cluster them together. I can also cluster them in by how, but how they work is much less exciting for most people than why. What's the measure by which they or you beat the state of the art for them? Another way of clustering things are by the measures they use. So when you're looking at doing a survey and looking at how to categorize stuff, that might be another way. Why is that goal important? This is go back to the motive or the theme, right? Why that property is important to measure. This is something not for the algorithm, but for the reader. And again, if you have a bunch of related things, that gives you a way of clustering them to put together groups. What conflicts, problems block the character? What makes this hard to do? So is there something about the data that's hard? Is there something about the underlying mathematical properties that make it hard? Is there something about the computational complexity? There's something that makes it hard. Again, there's another possibility that you can collect things by shared difficulties. And what are the risks, dangers if they're not successful? So lots of cybersecurity papers, for example, like to talk about the costs of breaches and whatever. That's the kinds of risks and dangers. There's physical systems risks and dangers. There can just be computational costs, right? Like it's going to cost the company a lot of money. What does the character do? Struggle to reach the goal. So in lots of the science papers, there will be an ablation study or some experiments on parts of it that help you understand what makes it work. This relates back to the traits of why it works. You want to be able to verify why it works. When you're looking at a survey paper, this might be in the underlying papers. There may not be a lot of this that can be useful for the survey itself, but it's an important part of many science papers. And then what sensory details make the system seem real? So do they have some sort of analogy? Themes and analogies are often related. They probably show some examples of success. They show some examples of failure cases. Again, when you're looking at things from a survey point of view, looking at what's the core science text story, some of those examples might be things you choose to include in your survey as examples of what other people did or examples of where they failed, because that's a way of making those elements, the characters, because a paper's main character might become one of your characters as well as you would put stuff together. The second type of science text story, and this is a different way of looking at them, is someone who is the main character is someone who's impacted by the science tech. So lots of security papers, privacy papers, tell their story this way, where the someone is impacted by the science or technology or the lack of it. And then there's some traits that make that character relatable. So if I'm looking at things where there's some sort of character who might have some sort of disability, or somebody whose privacy is violated, and that's going to cause them lots of problems. Those two things give you a different way of looking at not the science itself, but the problem, because these really relate back to the problem. What does the character need to do to say this? So how am I going to measure that I have helped this person who's been impacted? Why is that end result of the science or property important, right? This is, again, part of the storytelling. This is for the reader, not for the actual character. The conflicts and problems. So these last three here are very similar. The biggest difference in the science text story is it's not about the algorithm. It's about who's impacted by the algorithm, which changes how you do it. And again, there can be lots of ways when you're doing a survey paper to combine things based on who's someone who's impacted by the results. In fact, your classification can have both. Here's ways things happen, why they happen. Here's who's impacted. And that might be two different parts of your characterization as you put your story together. So I'm going to call this one, this is for survey paper. This was not in the main video. This is a slightly different main character, which is someone who is impacted by the topic being surveyed. And this is, if you're writing the survey for the main character now is the researcher that's reading the paper, but it could also be a customer or user of the science and technology. And so you're telling the story from the point of view of who's being impacted by the survey. This is really a variation of the V2 story, where for the V2 story is about being impacted by the science. Now it's about being impacted by the survey itself. And this can be a very effective survey paper, because if the reader relates to the story, they see themselves in the main character, they are the main character, then this paper can really speak to them. And then you get the same kinds of things. What makes the science relatable to the reader? What is the end result measured by how they've advanced the state of the art for the character, which in some sense is how are they ready to do something new? If you can point out new and open problems for the character, for the reader, right? That's something that they can relate to, and they can see why that's important. And this survey paper is going to open up 3 new related problems for you to be able to look at. That's a great story that people can relate to and get into as a researcher. And then again, a bunch of the same sort of shared elements. So that's trying to relate the storytelling aspects back to the survey paper. We'll touch on these again in a week or two when we get to some more of the survey as you get a little bit farther along. So for this first couple of things to get you going, so what are you going to do this week? Well, you're just going to sit down and write something. I want you to write some of your stories. Capture your thoughts and ideas the second they occur. It's amazing how often an idea pops into your head and you forget it and you don't get it down. Use your cell phone, capture those ideas right then. Write it like you would say it, or at least say it and capture it as auditory and then put it down later. You're going to be able to edit your thoughts and make things simpler and easier to do it, but you're going to edit early, often, and you're going to really write for your reader and for yourself. The beginning of your writing of your survey paper isn't for the audience. The reason I push so hard on the survey paper in this course is because understanding the lay of the land, understanding the literature and where you fit in it is a critical item for your thesis, for your research. You've got to understand what's been done, how they did it, and how you can do something new. But to get to the how you do something new, you got to get through the first two. So putting these ideas down will help you improve stuff. So some again, just sort of summary of some items to cover. Manage your time effectively. This is part of why I had you do last week's assignment. We had to do all of this about timing and whatever. You got to get through these papers. If you're going to survey 8 or 100 papers, you're going to have to get through them pretty quick. Don't think about this as writing. This is about communicating. You want to generate some ideas, whether it's use outlines, questions answering, brainstorming. We'll talk about some of these more in future things. Free writing, free talking, dictation. Use those to your advantage. So go through this assignment this week and try and get beyond just trying to think about writing in an orally fashion. This is about coming up with the ideas and how you put them together. So sorry I couldn't do this in person. Some of this can be fun, but hopefully this is going to help you advance as you head towards your survey paper. One last thing, if you're looking for more books reading to get into this material, Story Smart is one of Kendall Haven's book. Kendall is the speaker we have joining us on Monday. If you want to attend for some extra credit, here's a link to one of the two books. The book is on, two of his books are on reserve in the library, e-copy, so you can get the books from the library. You don't have to go buy them unless you want to keep your own copy like I did. Some video from him, and then Joshua Schimmel has a slightly different take on writing sciences, storytelling as well, but not as much as the Story Smart part from Kendall Haven. And so here's a link to that book as well.